My name is Otso, and I'll be speaking to you today about nuclear energy development in South and Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula in particular in the context of international efforts to dismantle the North Korean regime's nuclear weapons program. I'm going to argue that the prospects of stability on the Korean Peninsula under current nuclear disarmament efforts should not be overstated, and that a lasting solution cannot be limited to a disarmament-driven approach, but must instead be based on a transformation of inter-Korean relations that in the long term may include the prospect of extensive collaboration between South and North Korea, even in the field of nuclear energy. Now, the talk today will be divided into four sections. First, I'll talk about the current state of nuclear energy expansion in North and Southeast Asia to set the context for the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula. Against this backdrop, I'm going to explore the dynamics of the current North Korean nuclear disarmament efforts and dismiss the idea that North Korea is largely an irrational actor. In the third section, I propose that an international approach based on asymmetric economic statecraft could be more constructive. This could create conditions on the peninsula where North Korea's nuclear weapons could be dismantled through a more gradual and stable process by developing North Korea's self-sufficiency in a way that makes it less likely to exploit its nuclear card in negotiations. Finally, I argue that such an approach could utilize South Korea's nuclear export expertise and enable nuclear energy collaboration between North and South Korea in the longer term. I'm not going to spend too much time on the nuclear expansion in North and Southeast Asia because I think other speakers have covered quite a lot of that. But I think it'll suffice to say that the industry forecasts and government statements suggest that nuclear energy development in the region and on the Korean Peninsula will continue to expand and move into economies like Vietnam and Indonesia, for instance. South Korea is a major driver of that expansion. It's among the world's leading nuclear energy exporters and plans to expand its global market share to 20% by 2030. Domestically, it has plans to build 12 new nuclear reactors over the next 2 decades and has developed advanced waste management capabilities, making nuclear energy expertise a valuable asset for South Korea. In this environment, the challenge of dealing with the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and the new security concerns that arise with the entry of new producers into the market is an important concern, and many would argue that the inclusion of countries like North Korea in that expansion is a very serious proliferation risk. As a faltering economy, North Korea differs from other countries in the region in its growth and energy requirements forecasts. However, its active exclusion from this trend of energy development may not be constructive for regional security in the long term either. I'll now turn to examine the dynamics of the current approaches to the North Korean nuclear issue and how those approaches could be unified and altered in a manner that envisions an eventual nuclear energy future for North Korea through collaboration and the utilization of South Korea's extensive expertise in the export of nuclear reactors, technology, and services. Now, since the revelation of North Korea's highly enriched uranium program and the second North Korean nuclear crisis in late 2002, participants to the six-party talks have engaged North Korea bilaterally through differing strategies that have complicated their efforts to dismantle the North's nuclear program. From a theoretical perspective, the countries have engaged in a mix of coercive, conditional, and unconditional strategies of engagement, which have ranged from six-party talk, give and take, conditional, sequential staged approaches, to South Korea's unconditional engagement and attempt to create interdependence to North Korea through the pursuit of economic projects, humanitarian aid, and multilateral negotiations without preconditions. Further on, to the US and Japanese use of sanctions as coercive instruments with a focus almost solely on denuclearization in many cases. Now, while I can hope to chart the dynamics of these combined multilateral and bilateral efforts during this talk, I would argue that the lack of uniformity in these efforts to end North Korea's nuclear program is a source of weakness and friction that often works to the North's advantage. North Korea is often perceived to be an irrational actor when it comes to the foreign policy decisions it makes and the way that it negotiates. The disruption of the US-North Korean plan, hailed as a potential breakthrough in resuming the six-party talks in March, and North Korea's rocket launch on the 13th of April encapsulate the problems of negotiating with North Korea and really underline the reasons why it's often perceived as an irrational and entirely unpredictable actor. I would argue that this understanding is flawed. What's rational to, for instance, the United States from a homo economicus self-interest perspective does not necessarily correlate with another's perception of rationality. How then do we engage with North Korea in a constructive manner to resolve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula in a way that could best provide stability and a long-term solution? Jacques Foucault presents four useful assumptions that I've used as a foundation for this discussion of nuclear energy expansion as an incorporated part of a long-term solution on the peninsula. To summarize, Foucault first suggests that North Korea's nuclear program cannot be treated in isolation. Rather, it requires a comprehensive approach. Second, this comprehensive approach would require us to move beyond the imposition of international isolation, economic sanctions, or the extension of promises of economic benefits in return for nuclear dismantlement. Third, it assumes that a constructive approach must consider North Korea's ideological underpinnings and perceptual framework of the geopolitical landscape in which it exists. And fourth, that such a strategy based on engagement cannot be considered capitulation to the enemy, but an effort to move the US and its allies into a position of advantage over North Korea, which current approaches have arguably not been able to provide. Now, these four assumptions provide a framework in which working-level collaboration with North Korea on a range of economic and trade issues could lead to long-term rapprochement, of which nuclear collaboration can be a potential component. For our purposes, the third assumption is perhaps the most significant one for increasing the prospects of working-level rapprochement. Foucault suggests that North Korean foreign policy is highly influenced by the Yuche principle, which contains the ideas of self-reliance and the independence of action. The idea of self-reliance recognizes the pragmatism of accepting external assistance while moving toward the ideal of a self-reliant state, while the independence of action is never subservient to, nor does it exist under, external influence, actively rejecting what Kim Jong-il has called big power chauvinism. This framework allows the regime to exploit negotiations by understanding economic carrots in line with its principle of self-reliance, while rejecting concessions or the sticks that it perceives to infringe on its independence of action and military sovereignty. Consequently, this lack of transparency in North Korea, this framework would suggest that a successful policy would replace assistance programs, which in the North Korean context lack transparency, can be diverted to maintain current focus of funding on the nuclear program and the military first policy, and they also fail to induce positive perceptions of the aid providers due to this lack of transparency, which is often a benefit of humanitarian aid programs. Now, this could be replaced, I argue, with an asymmetric economic statecraft approach. I argue that such a strategy would be less susceptible to exploitation by North Korea and limit its application and employment of the nuclear card to exploit assistance programs. The benefit of an asymmetric economic statecraft approach lies in making North Korea economically dependent to the international community in a manner that denies it the benefits afforded by the principles it acts on to exploit aid arrangements. Instead, such a relationship could promote North Korean self-sufficiency through engagement in various economic and industrial collaborative undertakings that foster a dependency to the economically stronger countries pushing for the dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. South Korea, having taken the unconditional engagement approach until 2008, can provide some examples of such projects, including the Kaesong industrial complex constructed in 2000, which has continued to grow and operate through the growth or increase in inter-Korean tensions and even military confrontations which have resulted in casualties. Now, in late January of this year, South Korean companies at the complex employed a record number of over 50,000 North Korean workers. Were such a policy of engagement adopted multilaterally, it might be possible to link dismantlement efforts and the reintroduction of IAEA inspectors to the promise of removing the current trade impediments and supporting greater integration of North Korea into the world economy. Initial projects could include heavy and light industrial operations, agricultural development projects, and the establishment of new special economic zones within which joint manufacturing operations between foreign and North Korean companies could be undertaken. By increasing North Korea's dependence on stronger economies, the asymmetric economic statecraft approach could provide a long-term, comprehensive commitment to fundamentally bringing about change in North Korea, which would reduce its global threat posture. While this is arguably a very long-term approach, it could well provide a more sustainable and stable alternative to the current diverse framework of engagement. Making the leap to nuclear collaboration between North and South Korea would, of course, require the success of working-level economic collaboration, rapprochement, and a change in North Korea's perception of the value of its nuclear weapons program as a tool of negotiation. However, low-level nuclear collaboration or trade between South and North Korea at a point somewhere along the line of a unified AES approach is possible. One area of collaboration could be the management of radioactive waste. North Korea reportedly still has a problem with 8,000 spent Magnox fuel rods for which South Korea could offer management solutions. While South Korea is currently unable to reprocess any spent nuclear fuel under its 123 cooperation agreement with the United States, it has advanced waste storage facilities, and in case this cooperation agreement is renegotiated in ongoing talks, it has potential access to reprocessing capabilities in the future. An interesting aside that I've come across in my research is that following the Fukushima disaster, it's been reported that the Korean Electric Power Corporation has made attempts to recruit Japanese nuclear scientists who have recently left TEPCO, the equivalent company in Japan, with reprocessing expertise. So it appears that there's quite a big chance that South Korea may be actively developing its knowledge and expertise capability were the situation with the 123 agreement to change after these negotiations. Now, depending on North Korea's level of commitment to existing demands for the dismantlement of its nuclear weapons program, South Korea and others would be in a more integrated position further down the line to engage in the eventual development of a domestic nuclear power program in North Korea, a measure that under the right circumstances would foster stability by not forcing the exclusion of North Korea from regional energy trends. In conclusion, for 20 years, the perceived irrationality of North Korea and its regime has provided a stumbling block for international efforts to dismantle its nuclear weapons program. Parties to the six-party talks have engaged North Korea bilaterally through different means, in many ways allowing North Korea to exploit its nuclear program as a tool for aid extraction. Testament to North Korea's successful implementation of this extraction is its receipt of over 10.1 million tons of aid between 1995 and 2006. That's the most aid received by any country in the world, and it's 800,000 tons more than the aid received by Ethiopia during the same period. I've argued for an alternative approach that might help overcome some of the obstacles and alter North Korea's ability to exploit its nuclear program as a means to sustain its regime unreformed. An understanding of the U-shaped principle is central to this approach, not to give it any kind of legitimacy, but to be able to better respond to North Korea's behavior and maneuver oneself accordingly. The asymmetric economic statecraft approach could go further than previous approaches in changing the North's behavior through fostering economic dependency and collaboration in a range of economic and industrial projects. Such an approach would leave an open door for the eventual inclusion of North Korea in a regional expansion of nuclear energy, avoiding or at least softening a potential blow or potential source of tension in the future. The same approach could turn small-scale nuclear cooperation, including waste management, in time into larger projects that could utilize South Korea's and others' expertise and experience in the export of reactor technology. Thanks for your attention.